The interpretation of unclean spirit using a medical diagnosis. Introduction. In the biblical context, the term unclean spirit is mentioned in various passages, particularly in the New Testament, where it describes individuals possessed by spirits that cause them distress and disrupt their normal behavior. Mark 5:2-13. In the biblical medical understanding, the term unclean spirit is seen as a metaphor for mental and physical conditions that arise from imbalances in the brain. These imbalances can lead to illnesses such as schizophrenia and epilepsy, where the individual's behavior and perception are disrupted. Matthew 17, verse 4-18. The unclean spirit is therefore linked to disturbances in the brain's functioning, rather than being a supernatural entity, and reflects the impact of these conditions on a person's mental and emotional state. Luke 9:39. The biblical medical interpretation of unclean spirit takes a unique perspective, viewing it not as a supernatural entity, but rather as a metaphorical representation of certain medical conditions, including epilepsy and schizophrenia. This interpretation seeks to bridge the gap between ancient spiritual beliefs and contemporary medical understanding. Unclean spirits, Greek, akathartos, definition, medical perspective. Unclean spirits, Hebrew, Greek, akathartos, in the biblical context, symbolic representations of physical illnesses or medical conditions affecting the brain, mind, and overall health. From the medical perspective, unclean spirits are not impure entities, but rather a biblical description of various physical ailments, which may include seizures. Mark 9, verse 17-29, schizophrenic psychosis, delusions, hallucinations, emotional turmoil, blindness, Matthew 12:22, arthritis, Luke 13:11, Proverbs 17:22, among others. These conditions are seen as a symbolic representation of impurity, potentially caused by sin and disobedience, resulting in afflictions and distress in individuals. 1 Samuel 16:14, leading to psychosomatic effects. Proverbs 17, verse 22. Historical and cultural context. The biblical medical interpretation emphasizes the importance of understanding the Bible within its historical and cultural context. In the time when the New Testament was written, medical knowledge was limited, and people often attributed various physical and mental ailments to the influence of spirits, gods, or demons. Mark 9, verse 25. The term unclean spirit emerged from this belief system, where it was used to describe illnesses or behaviors that were not well understood at the time. Luke 8:2. Unclean spirit as physical illness. In the biblical medical interpretation, unclean spirit is seen as a metaphor for physical illnesses that affect an individual's mental health and behavior. One notable example is epilepsy, a neurological disorder characterized by recurrent seizures. During an epileptic seizure, a person may exhibit unusual behaviors and lose control over their body. These symptoms might have been interpreted as the work of an unclean spirit in ancient times. Matthew 17:14-18, Mark 9:17-29. Similarly, the biblical medical interpretation suggests that conditions like schizophrenia, a complex mental disorder, could have been described using the term unclean spirit. Schizophrenia can involve hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking, leading to behaviors that might have been perceived as the result of spiritual possession. Mark 5, verse 3-5. Biochemical imbalance and mental health. According to the biblical medical interpretation, the unclean spirit metaphor can also be linked to biochemical imbalances in the brain. Modern medicine recognizes that mental health conditions, including schizophrenia, are associated with irregularities in neurotransmitters and brain chemistry. Luke 8:27-29. These imbalances can significantly impact an individual's thoughts, emotions, and behavior. The use of the term spirit in this context is not meant to imply a supernatural entity, but rather to denote the sentient element in man through which he perceives, reflects, feels, and desires. Matthew 12:43-45. The unclean spirit is, therefore, a symbolic representation of the person's mind or mental state affected by the medical condition. The interpretation suggests that the symptoms associated with the presence of an unclean spirit in biblical accounts align with known medical conditions like schizophrenia and epilepsy. Matthew 17:15-18. This perspective acknowledges that these conditions are rooted in physical processes within the body, specifically imbalances in brain chemistry. Integration of faith and health. The biblical medical interpretation seeks to harmonize religious beliefs with scientific knowledge. Rather than viewing illness solely as a spiritual matter, it acknowledges that health problems can have physiological and psychological causes. Mark 9:28-29. By using a medical diagnosis to interpret unclean spirit as physical and mental illnesses, we aim to encourage a balanced approach to understanding and addressing health issues within a religious context. James 5:14-15. In summary, the biblical medical diagnosis, understanding of demons, unclean spirits, and evil spirits, departs from traditional interpretations. These terms are not seen as representing malevolent spiritual beings, but are rather understood as symbolic representations of physical illnesses, emotional turmoil, and psychosomatic responses as the consequences of sin and disobedience to God's commands. Deuteronomy 28:15-68. This interpretation aligns with the medical diagnosis of the observable and quantifiable aspects of these conditions, both in the biblical context and in modern medical terminology.